We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Lord, we shall overcome someday.
So let me turn to this famous photograph. Crossing Selma's Pettus Bridge, Edmund Pettus Bridge. The Pettus Bridge is named for a Confederate general, and it leads out of the town of Selma, and it's curved, which means that the marchers leaving Selma didn't know what was waiting for them at the bottom of the bridge on Bloody Sunday until they reached the crest of the bridge. This march took place a couple of weeks later, in March of 1965. It's become an iconic image in Jewish circles, and in, I would say, in American circles more widely. It's a multicultural, multi-faith mélange, a photograph that in some sense represents a kind of eschatological dream. Here's a religious Jew, a rabbi from a Hasidic family in Poland. There's a nun from St. Louis, black and white, Ralph Bunch, Reverend Vivian, Reverend Abernathy, John Lewis, Dr. King, walking arm in arm. Someone from Hawaii brought leis for them to wear. Marching, calling for Congress to pass the Voting Rights Act, protesting racism in Jim Crow America. My father and Dr. King met for the first time in Chicago in 1963. They participated in civil rights demonstrations. They gave lectures together. They went to Christian groups, Jewish groups, interfaith, universities. My father had arrived in the United States as a refugee from Hitler's Europe in March of 1940. He said he was plucked as a brand from the fires. He came to this country barely knowing English. Meeting Dr. King in 1963, and I remember it quite well in January of that year, was quite extraordinary for my father. It was an unusual friendship in those days. It was surprising for many people, and it was also inspiring. Continues to be. Two people from such different backgrounds, different countries, different religions, and yet they bonded. They bonded. What brought them together? What brought them together? How to save the soul of America. They read the Bible in similar ways. They saw in each other something very special, a source of inspiration for each of them. My father used to talk about Dr. King all the time at home. He thought about him. He respected him. He felt a bond of friendship that was very strong, and my father didn't have that many friends, I want you to know. Where they met in Chicago was a conference organized by the National Conference of Christians and Jews, a conference called Religion and Race, where each one gave a keynote lecture. They had known of each other, but they hadn't met until that point. Dr. King spoke with the title, A Challenge to Justice and Love. He spoke in a very straightforward way, affirming that the struggle against racism was an interfaith event. And I'll read you a little piece from his speech. He said, the churches and synagogues have an opportunity and a duty to lift their voices like a trumpet and declare into the people the immorality of segregation. We must affirm that every human life is a reflex of divinity, and every act of injustice mars and defaces the image of God in man. The undergirding philosophy of segregation is diametrically opposed to the undergirding philosophy of our Judeo-Christian heritage, and all the dialectics of the logicians cannot make them lie down together. I read that passage because my father's words are so similar to Dr. King's. My father began his speech by saying, at the first conference on religion and race, the main participants were Pharaoh and Moses. Moses' words were, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may celebrate a feast to me." While Pharaoh retorted, "Who is the Lord that I should heed this voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." My father went on to say that the outcome of that summit meeting between Pharaoh and Moses has not yet come to an end. Pharaoh is not ready to capitulate, he said. The Exodus began, but is far from having been completed. In fact, it was easier for the children of Israel to cross the Red Sea than for a Negro to cross certain university campuses. I went to visit the home where my father had slept the night before the march. Dr. King had lived in this home for several months. It belonged to Dr. and Mrs. Sullivan Jackson. Dr. Jackson was a dentist, African-American dentist in Selma. His wife was a teacher, and they had a little girl, Joanna, who's now grown up. And that home has been preserved. The furniture is there. The telephone Dr. King used to speak to the president, for example. And Mrs. Jackson told me what it was like that day of the Selma March. I want to tell you this. She said that when she woke up that morning, she went into the living room, and there had been several people sleeping on chairs and sofas. And there she saw Dr. King standing and praying in one side of the room. My father was standing and praying in another part of the room. A couple of other people were praying in the other end of the living room and in the dining room. She was very moved by that, and I'm very moved by that. I think that's an extraordinary image, and it's an amazing room to visit. And I regret very much that when the film was made, Selma, and she's an extraordinary young filmmaker, and I admire what she accomplished very much, but I'm sorry that that wasn't depicted, that instead there was a scene in the kitchen with Mrs. Jackson cooking breakfast for everybody. But that image of everyone standing and praying in their own way, that was also something that Dr. King gave to us in the Civil Rights Movement.